started. My name is Caitlin, and I am with Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. And we host a monthly Native Prairie speaker series, either online as a webinar or in person in a rural community in Saskatchewan. And we're really excited to be here in Eastend. It's been a while since we made it here since COVID. And this evening we'll be talking about bats. So Lauren is with the University of Saskatchewan, and she's our speaker this evening. But before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. And for millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. And I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And financial support for today's presentation is from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And just to note, we'll record the presentation for people who can't make it here in person tonight, and we'll put it on our YouTube channel in the near future, probably later this week. And if you are ever interested, you can check out our YouTube channel for a really great inventory of webinars and past presentations. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter. Lauren MacDonald is a current researcher at the University of Saskatchewan, where she works under Dr. Jeffery Lane to study 2 of the endangered species of bats in Saskatchewan. And she received her master's degree in science from New Mexico State University, where she studied immunology in Pallid Bats. And she's worked with bats for a number of years, now throughout Saskatchewan, as well as Ontario, the American Southwest, Belize, and even Guyana. So, take it away.
Alright, so today I'm hoping to teach you all a little bit about bats and to uncover some of their more peculiar aspects. As Caitlin said, my name is Lauren. I do have a co-host, Jeff the Bat. He is in the front row right now, but that's okay. He can hang out there. There he is. He's a great co-host and entertainer. So today I am hoping to teach you all about what bats are, look at some of the really common myths around bats, as well as look at bats around the world and the diversity that is around the world, and then focus into the bats in Saskatchewan, and then what we can do to help our bats, especially our endangered bat species. So my first question to all of you, who here has seen a bat before? Ooh, I would say the majority of you guys, yeah. So I think it's fairly common being kind of out in like rural Saskatchewan. They might be in your barns, you might have seen them in the tree. Lots of people have seen a bat before, but they might not necessarily know a lot about bats. You know, they're these dark, furry creatures that fly at night. You might have got a glimpse of one, but you might not know or understand a lot behind them because there's kind of this mystery around this nocturnal neighbor that we have. So what is a bat? There are tons of flying questions, so maybe I'll ask my front row helpers. Do you think a bat is a bird? Is a bat a type of bird? Yeah? They both fly, right? We don't know. So, no, that's okay. So bats and birds both fly, but bats are not birds. They don't have feathers, they don't have beaks, they don't lay eggs, so they're very different from birds. And there's a lot of other creatures that fly, like insects, and we also have things like flying fish and flying frogs and flying lizards, all these kind of gliding things. But bats don't belong to any of these groups. They are instead the only flying mammal. So they're a mammal just like a pet dog or a pet cat. They're just like us, like humans are mammals. And you might think, hey, what about the flying squirrel? They fly, right? It's in the name, but that is not true. Flying squirrels can glide, which is just a nice way of saying they can fall really gracefully. Bats, on the other hand, have powered flight. They can take off and sustain flight, but they are a mammal and the only mammal that can sustain flight. And they might look different than our other mammals. They look pretty different from us humans or us dogs or whatever, but when we look internally, they actually do look a lot more like mammals. So So when you look at a bat and when you look at a human, if you look underneath the skin at the bones, they actually have the same bones as us in their wings. The same arm bones that we have, a bat has. And it extends all the way down to where our fingertips are actually the bat wings themselves. So whereas a chicken might fly with its arms and go bok, 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 a bat actually flies with its hands, kind of like jazz hands that can fly. And this is really interesting for bats since they are really, really maneuverable because they're flying with their hands rather than their full arms. And they have this skin that's stretched between their fingers, which is a little like the skin between our fingers. It's just if it went the whole way. And it makes them really, really fast and really, really maneuverable. So they're actually better than birds and better than insects at flying. They can fly quicker through more cluttered areas than, say, a bird can. And there's other ways that we might be able to compare bats with other mammals. They're similar in other ways that we might not think of. Bats, for example, can live a really long time. Just like humans or elephants can live long times, some species of bats, like some of the Myotis species that we have here in Saskatchewan, can live over 40 years, which is a really, really long time for such a small animal. It would be the equivalency of a human living up to 100 years, but still flying and chasing insects and going throughout the night at 100 years old. So it's really, really old for bats. They're also like other mammals because they're really, really fast. They are fast like cheetahs. You know a cheetah, right? Yeah. Well, fun fact is that bats, like the Brazilian freetail, who's our little helper, that little species, can actually go over 160 kilometers an hour, which is faster than a cheetah. So when people say that cheetahs are the fastest mammals, they're lying. It's actually a bat. And bats are like mammals in lots of other ways too, in that they give birth to live pups and they feed them milk, they breastfeed them. And they're really, really social and have this really caring aspect when they have these pups. They live in colonies, they groom each other, and even if a mom dies, another mom will adopt that pup and take care of it. So they're these really social creatures, kind of like we see in other mammal groups. But because they fly, they're also really different than other mammals. One, because they fly, but then all these other things that are crazy because of that. For example, bats have the largest relative heart size of all mammals. You might know that the largest heart in the world is the blue whale, but if it's just compared to the size of the animal itself, bats actually take the cake. And that massive heart, which can weigh up to 2% of their entire body weight, whereas a human heart can only weigh about 0.3% of our total weight, can beat up to 1,000 times a minute to sustain flight. Flight is really, really hard to do. It's like sprinting a marathon every second that you're in the air. It's really challenging. So they have to have this crazy physiology to allow them to fly like a massive heart beating so quickly. One of the other things that bats beat out other animals on is because their pups have to learn to fly so quickly, it means the moms have to pop them out pretty fully formed. So they win the cake for the largest relative baby size, being 1/3 of their mom's weight, which would be like me, a 150-pound woman, giving birth to a 50-pound baby. Which for moms in the audience, you will know that that makes bats super moms. And then they will often have to fly with their pups attached and breastfeeding. So imagine a 50-pound baby doing that. And we also have these fun things where bats have evolved to fly, which means they've evolved to hang upside down. And it makes for an easy getaway because when they're upside down, they can just release their feet and take off and go. But because they sleep upside down, it wouldn't make sense for them to be like us where, we have to hold on to something. So instead, when we relax our hands, they're nice and floppy. But when bats relax their toes, they're actually clamped down. So when they're fully relaxed, it means that they can hang and sleep on whatever rock or tree they're hanging out on. Or when they hibernate and they're not even close to being awake, they're able to hold on. So now that we know a little bit about what bats are, I like to address some of the bat myths right off the bat. No pun intended. So, some of the most common myths I come across is that all bats are vampires or bloodsuckers. What do you guys think? Do you think that all bats are vampires? Yeah? What about you guys? Do you think bats only drink blood? No. No, there are lots of different species of bats, and there are lots of bats that eat lots of other things than blood. That being said, it is somewhat true because there are 3 species of bats that drink blood. There are 3 types of vampire bats. However, there are over 1,400 species in total, and only 3 of those are vampires. They all live in the tropics, so you don't need to worry about it, and they don't drink human blood, so we definitely don't need to worry about these vampires. They like to drink things like cow blood. They often go after the livestock in those regions. And bloodsucker is a total misnomer anyway, because no bat actually sucks blood. What they do is they bite and then they lick it up. So bloodsucker is just totally false. And then if you're like me, you've heard the phrase, "you're blind as a bat," a bunch of times. Is that something anyone here has heard before? Yeah, me too. Do we think that bats are blind? Kind of general murmur of no. We have a yes. It's because they use echolocation, right? And you're right, they do use echolocation, but their eyes are perfectly fine. They can see just as well as us, but because they fly at night, they use echolocation. However, they can still navigate by sight, they can see perfectly fine, and there's even species like in Australia and China and Africa, the really big flying foxes only use sight to navigate. They don't even have echolocation. So blind as a bat is totally false. This guy, he's a fraud. Don't listen to him. He's totally fine. He can see. And then one of the next myths that I have truly no idea where it started from, but it's something my grandma insists is true, is that bats get caught in your hair or will make a nest in your hair. It's just not right. Bats have incredibly sensitive echolocation. Their echolocation is so fine that they can detect a single strand of human hair, and they do not want to be near us. So they are more than capable of detecting us and avoiding us. So I confidently say that bats are never going for human hairs. Maybe they're swooping for a mosquito that was about to bite you, but they want nothing to do with your or my hair. So this is totally a myth. There's also this big myth that bats are just this really big or scary thing, and that's because people don't understand them. They're mysterious, and often those mysteries grow bigger and bigger in our mind. There are tons of really small species of bats out there, and to me, I think that nothing is scary if you understand them. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, if you think bats are scary, you won't. There's also a lot of myths about bats being really diseased or really dirty. Now, bats are actually a lot like cats. They groom themselves and each other. So they're quite clean. They keep themselves and their fur really clean. And now bats do have things like diseases. They're known to have viruses like rabies or other types of viruses. However, it's really rare for bats to carry them. Way less than 1% carry them. And it's even rarer for them to pass them to humans. That being said, they can be dangerous, so never grab a bat barehanded. If you grab a bat, it will bite you because it's wildlife. It doesn't want to be grabbed. That being said, it's rare for them to transmit disease, so it's not something that we should necessarily think of as everything a bat is, but it is something to take into consideration, say if you have a bat in your home, not to grab it with your bare hand, to get a bucket or something like that. So now that we've looked at some of the major myths of bats, let's take a look at the bats around the world. As I said, there are 1,400 species of bats, which is a lot of bats. In some of the tropical areas, like in Latin America or in Asia, there are hundreds and hundreds of species of bats over there. And if you were to list all mammal species in the world, bats would make up a fifth of all mammals. That's how diverse they are. So they are everywhere from, the Canadian territories where it's cold and it's only summer for a couple months, down to deserts where there's species of bats that only drink once every couple months. So they are everywhere, and because of that, they're really, really diverse. And we see that diversity crop up in a lot of different ways. For example, we can have really, really small bats and really, really big bats. So the smallest bat in the world is the bumblebee bat. And this bat weighs just 2 grams, which is less than a penny. And if it were to be on your hand, it would be about the size of your thumbnail. It is the smallest mammal on Earth. It is tiny, tiny, tiny. And yet, we can go all the way up to the flying foxes, which are massive bats. These are the bats that fly during the day. They don't have echolocation. And the biggest one, the golden-crowned flying fox, can weigh 1,200 grams, and it can have a wingspan of 2 meters, which is taller than me. It could basically envelop me in its wings. So bats can be everything from that tiny bumblebee bat to the massive flying fox. And we see this diversity crop up in other ways, like what bats look like. Bats can look like a lot of different things. We can get these really pretty bats, like the northern ghost bat, which has this pure white fur and yellow ears. And if you were to open up its wings, it's so clear and transparent that you could read a book through its wings. And then we get species like the greater fruit-eating bat, who has this really large nose leaf, which I still think it's cute, but these large nose leaves help it echolocate better. And these bats can have things like stripes. And then we have bats that are really weird, like the wrinkle-faced bat. I don't really have anything nice to say about him. I think he's pretty ugly, actually. But he's still a bat, despite his looks. And we can see this in so many different ways across all of the species of bats. There are bats with really big eyes. There's bats with really big ears. There's bats with really big noses. There's bats that are white and red and brown. There's bats with stripes down their back. There's bats with spots on their back. They look so different than just the kind of like brown mouse-looking flying creature. You can have bats of all kinds, handsome and ugly. I think lots of people would agree there's a lot of ugly ones up here, but some of them are cute, I think. And we also see all of these different bats also live and eat different things because of all of this diversity in that 1,400 species. So, where do we know that bats live? Do we have some ideas about where bats might live? Yeah.
By water?
By water is great. That is so general. I'm looking for something specific, but by water is 100% correct. Something like maybe a cave. We definitely know bats live in caves and crevices under rocks. Do we know of any other places that bats might live?
Yeah.
Old buildings, yes. They love human structures. They love bridges and buildings. If you're not a fan of bats, I do not suggest looking up if you're ever under bridges. They love the cracks and crevices of bridges. But yes, buildings, attics, old barns are, especially in Saskatchewan, they are a fan of old barns and homesteads. They like the warmth of these buildings and the cramped spaces they can find. We also see lots of species that live on trees. They either just hang out on the bark of a tree, or they hang out around the foliage, the leaves, and they might, be amongst the leaves pretending to be a leaf. They also live in things like bat boxes. These are just homes that we provide for the bats, so it's a place we often find them. Then bats are also found in areas like mines or abandoned mines. These are kind of man-made caves, and bats frequently find and populate them. There's also lots of bats that are found inside trees. They use tree hollows, but especially in Saskatchewan, they frequently crawl up underneath the bark of dead trees. They find this little gap on snags where the bark is starting to peel, and they squish right up into them. They love having like the pressure against their front side and the back side, so frequently they're found in snags. And then because there's 1,400 species of bats, some bats do really, really weird things, like the northern ghost bats, which are these nice, pretty white ones we saw. They actually make tents out of leaves. So they find these really big leaves in the tropics, and they go along and they bite the top stem, causing it to fold over, and then they crawl underneath. So there are always strange things that bats are doing, like making leaf tents. And different bats might have different roosts depending on the time of year or what sex they are. So here in Canada, these are some of the common types of roosts we have. The first is the maternity roost. This is usually when you're thinking of bats, you're thinking of like a large colony in an attic or a large colony in a cave. Frequently, that's the maternity roost, which just means the roost where all of the moms gather during their pregnancy and to have their pups. They kind of co-raise all of their pups together because it's a nice warm place and safe place for all their pups to be. So frequently we find maternity roosts in the spring and summer. Now while the females are having a great time snuggling with all the other females and having their pups and whatnot, the boys have been kicked out and they get to live on a tree by themselves. So we often see a single species might have maternity roosts in a building, while the males are actually all solitary and living on trees. And then we have things like swarming sites, which is about now is when we're getting swarming sites in the fall. This is where the males and females go to mate in the fall before they go to hibernate, which is our last root, the roost, the hibernaculum, which is frequently the caves and abandoned mines where bats might hibernate over winter. So depending on the species and depending on the sex, a single species can have up to 4 different roosts per year, or maybe more if they move around. So there's a lot of different places you might find bats. Now, our diversity we also see in what bats eat. What are some of the things we know bats eat? Fruit is a good one. Not often the first one people call out, but yes.
Insects.
Insects are another really big one. Do we know of anything else they eat? I've already mentioned one of them. Blood, yeah. They also eat other things too. So as we already said, they eat flying insects. In Saskatchewan, this is often the ones we think of. They eat mosquitoes. They eat a lot of crop pests. They really love moths. They also eat beetles and flies. But you might not think of the non-flying insects. There's species of bats that eat things like spiders or things that crawl on the ground or leaves, and they just swoop down and pick them up from where they are. As we said, they also eat fruit, things like mangoes and bananas and figs. Now, these are all the tropical bats. We don't have fruit-eating bats up in Canada because we don't have fruit enough of the time to sustain these bats. But further south, we get those fruit-eating bats. We also don't often think of bats that eat nectar, and these are actually pollinators. And bats pollinate just like birds, just like a hummingbird or an insect like a butterfly or a bee would. So they have these really long noses and really long tongues that can get deep into a flower, just like how a hummingbird has a really long beak. So there are lots of species of plants, which we'll discuss later, in which bats pollinate for us. We, of course, then also have our vampire bats. This is a vampire bat. He kind of looks like a pig, that drink blood. Of course, not many of them do, but there are 3 species that do. Now, there's some weirder bats out there that eat really strange things, like fish. There's a fishing bat called Noctilio, and it has these really, really long toes and legs that it drags along the surface of the water until it finds a minnow or a fish, and then it pulls it up, catches it in its little tail, and eats that. And that's a great point too, because most people don't expect it that, but bats are really good swimmers. They kind of use their wings like oars. So all species of bats can swim, but particularly the fishing bat is really good at swimming because when you fish, you have to be. There's also lots of species that eat strange things like frogs and lizards. There's species in the tropics that actually don't use echolocation to find their food. They land on the jungle floor and they listen for the frog ribbits and croaks, and then they go find the frog based on the noise that they're hearing. And then my favorite bat, which is why I always have to mention it, is the pallid bat, which is what I study. And it can eat things like scorpions and centipedes and venomous stuff. And why I think that's so interesting is because they're completely immune to the venom. So they, when they go for a scorpion, get stung over and over again as they're eating the scorpion, and they are just totally unfazed because they're 100% immune to scorpion venom and stings. And I just think that's fascinating.
What kind of bat is that again?
A pallid bat.
Pallid.
Pallid, P-A-L-L-I-D. They're called that because they're nice and pale. They're kind of this light fur color. Yeah. So you might think, we've already mentioned it a couple times, but how do bats find their food? They hunt at night for the most part, and it's dark out. No, they use echolocation. And echolocation is when they emit noises, really high frequency pulses that we can't hear, and they emit it over and over again, and they listen for it to come back like an echo. And what it bounces back allows them to kind of make an image in their mind of what they're seeing, but it's really what they're hearing. And each species, depending on what it eats and where it lives and whether it has to fly through really dense forest versus whether it flies through open plains, it changes what the echolocation actually looks like. Because we can't hear the echolocation, as researchers, we like to visualize the calls that we pick up. And when we look at the echolocation of each species, it looks different. And because of this, we're able to use something like echolocation to detect and then identify which bats are flying above us. And this is really effective because you might not think of bats as being really, really loud, but they are really, really loud. Their echolocation, if it were in our hearing range, would be as loud as a police siren. So we can put a detector pretty far away and pick up the bats flying way above it because of how loud they are. So now that we've learned more about the diversity of bats, let's talk about why they're important and why we should care about the bats. Now, the one really big important thing, especially in Saskatchewan, is their pest control. They eat tons of insects that we don't like. You know, they eat the mosquitoes in our backyards, but more in terms of economic gains, they eat a lot of the crop pests that we don't like. And it's estimated that they save farmers in the forestry industry billions of dollars worth of either pesticide use or just in protecting crops from unnecessary pest damage. So they're really, really important ecologically for keeping the insect downs, but also economically for helping our farmers out. As we mentioned, there's also lots of bats that are pollinators. They pollinate a lot of plants that we like. Things like avocados and bananas and mango are all pollinated by bats. But the one I normally point to is that they are the primary pollinator of the agave plant, which is the plant that makes tequila. So, without bats, you would not have tequila at all. So, if you like tequila, you like bats, exactly. And there's also lots of species that eat the fruit, and that's really important because they end up distributing the seeds. Bats that eat fruit have to eat a lot of fruit. They eat almost 2.5 times their body weight every night in fruit, and it moves through them really quickly, which means they end up pooping out the seeds all over because they fly really long distances. So there's over 3,000 plants where their long distance seed dispersal are bats. And it's also really important, especially in the tropics where all these fruit eaters are, that bats are primarily responsible for regrowing deforested forests because they're flying over these open stretches and pooping out all of these seeds, which are then helping to regrow all of these areas. So they're very important. Oh yes, I forgot about my fun fact about pest control. For a more anecdotal pest control story, there's a library in Portugal that has had bats living in the library for over 300 years, And for those 300 years, the bats have single-handedly protected all their historical manuscripts and archives from the bugs that might be consuming them. So they are also helpful in other means. And then some of the other ways in which bats might be important, but you might not often think about it. One is their guano. Their poop is actually quite valuable. In modern days, it's used in fertilizer. It's not a large market, but it's a couple $1 million worth of bat guano being used as fertilizer. But what I find more interesting is that historically their guano was worth a lot of money, and that's because it was used to make gunpowder. There was a chemical in it used to make gunpowder. And this was so important that in President Millard Fillmore's U.S. president, his State of the Union address in 1850, he dedicated several lines to addressing the price of guano and promised to drop the price. That's how important this was. It made it into a president's State of the Union address. And for those curious, a pound of guano was worth $76 back in 1850, so he had promised to lower that price. So, now that we've seen the diversity, now that we've seen why we care about bats, let's talk about the bats that we have here in Saskatchewan. So, North America in total has 47 species of bats, of which Saskatchewan has 8. It's not a lot of bats compared to the tropics, but they are 8 important species of bats. It's hard to get a lot of species up here because it gets so cold over winter. Down in the tropics, there can be, hundreds of species of bats, and they can enjoy being awake and around all year where it's warm. So for the 8 species of bats that we have in Saskatchewan, all of them are insect eaters. All of them are eating things like mosquitoes and moths and beetles and flies and other things like spiders or grasshoppers. All live in things like houses or barns or trees. We don't have as many caves or rock crevices in Saskatchewan because it's Saskatchewan. We just don't have a lot of caves. So they're often found in things like trees and our man-made structures instead of caves. Of the species we have here, 5 of the 8 are endangered. So it's important to learn about them and learn about what we can do for them. So as I mentioned, it gets very cold in Saskatchewan and bats are not able to survive here over winter. So what are some of the things that bats might do to help them survive the cold winter? Do we have an idea of where bats go in the winter? Heated attic is a good idea. Unfortunately, if there's no bugs for them to eat, they don't like the heated attic because they will just starve to death. But they might opt for an maybe. We have a couple ways that bats handle the cold. The first one is hibernation. They might like a cold attic because they can hibernate in it. Now, bats need really specific temperature ranges for things like hibernation. They want a place that's 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, so they frequently use caves or abandoned mines. Sometimes an attic that isn't heated might be cold enough for them. And this area, this stage of their life as hibernation is kind of crazy. They're like bears. They put on weight in the fall, and then they go into this really, really deep sleep where they're able to just sleep the winter away. Now bats, the same bats that hearts can beat 1,000 times a minute when they fly, when they go into hibernation, that heart rate drops to just 4 times a minute. And they might only breathe once an hour. So they are really shutting down their systems. They're not using the energy and they're surviving fully off of the fat stores. Now, just because they hibernate all winter doesn't mean they sleep all winter. They do sometimes wake up to go pee or to get a drink of water, but for the most part, they can only wake up a couple times before they have to go back into that really deep sleep of hibernation to survive when there's no bugs for them to eat. Now, there's another way that bats might survive winter, and we don't often think of bats, but they also migrate. We often think of birds as migrating, we're starting to see the geese move. There's also bats that are on the move, but we don't see them because they fly at night. So bats do hibernate southwards to climates, to more milder climates that they can handle. And one of the species here can actually migrate up to 2,500 kilometers, which is the same as about here to Tucson, Arizona. So they can go a really long ways. And that same species can fly up to 8,000 feet up. So they're a lot like birds in which they can go really far and really high up and really fast. We just don't think of them as that because they do it all at night and we don't see them. Now, unlike birds, they don't tend to form the V or go in large groups. They tend to hibernate more individually or in small little clumps. So let's meet some of our Saskatchewan bats. We have 3 migratory species. All 3 of these species are endangered. The first bat is the Silverhaired Bat. I like this bat. It's really, really small, and I find it quite striking because it has this pitch black hair that has little gray tips on it, kind of giving it a silver appearance. And this bat, unlike the big colonies we see, tends to be solitary. It lives on its own or in really small groups on trees. It often lives on the outer bark of trees, and that appearance, that dark appearance with the gray, actually allows them to camouflage into the bark of trees. Now, there's not a lot of bat predators out there, but owls and falcons will both eat bats, so there is some benefit to camouflaging into the tree you're living into. There are also other migratory species here, including the eastern red bat, who I also think is quite handsome. It's this really stunning red bat. And frequently this bat is also solitary and lives in trees, but instead of living on the bark of the tree, it actually hangs from the leaves and the foliage. So it hangs from one of the twigs, and it will actually hang from 1 foot to kind of sell itself as a leaf. It'll be on a leaf or a pine cone or something like that. But it's able to look like a leaf by fooling the predators by hanging from 1 foot instead. These ones also migrate, but these ones tend to migrate more westward, say into BC, where there's a bit of a milder climate. They might migrate and then hibernate elsewhere, but they do not hibernate here. They need a bit more milder. They've been known to hibernate in leaf litter, which is just a pile of leaves left at fall, which is insane. It's a really weird thing that they do. And then our last migrator is the hoary bat, who's also this really interesting bat who has this kind of yellow plumage around its face. This is the biggest bat we have in Canada. It's still not very big. It's just about 20 grams with a wingspan that maybe is about that big. But it is the biggest one that we have here in Canada. This is the one that can go 2,500 kilometers south and 8,000 feet up during hibernation. It's also one of the bats that has the largest ranges of anywhere in the world. This bat can be found in Iceland, all throughout Canada, all the way over to Hawaii, down through North America, down through Central America, and into Chile. So it can go it's found in a lot of different places, and it can go a really long ways. So then we have our hibernators. We have 5 hibernator species. The first one is the little brown bat. This is one of the species I study because it's endangered. This is also the species that can live a really, really long time. Actually, just near here in Cypress Hills, a couple years back, researchers found a bat that was banded 37 years before that date. So that wild bat was at least 37 years old in Cypress. It could have been older because it was banded as an adult. So they can live a really, really long time. We also have things like the big brown bats. I like to call the big brown bat a knockoff of the little brown bat. It's a little more common. They're often found in cities. They're just a little bigger. But the big brown bat is the most tolerant to things like cities. So if you happen to see a bat while you're in the city or in the town, chances are it's actually a big brown bat. They're most commonly found roosting in someone's attic. We also have the western small-footed bat. This is the smallest bat that we have in Canada and in Saskatchewan. It is only 4.5 grams, which is just twice as heavy as that bumblebee bat. So it's a pretty small little bat. They also live in small groups and can live in things like crevices, and they like the dry regions, so they're found more in this area in southern Saskatchewan. Then our second endangered migrator or hibernator species is the northern Myotis bat. Now this is our third Myotis bat. Myotis meaning mouse-eared. So this, the little brown bat, the northern bat, and the western small-footed bat are all related. They're all pretty closely related, and apparently a scientist at one point thought they all had mouse-like ears. So this bat is found a little more north. It wouldn't be found necessarily around here. And then we have the long-eared bat, another Myotis bat. These ones are a lot less fun to look at than the migrators. They're all kind of similar looking. They're all related. They're all the classic boring brown bat. Both the northern long-eared bat, and the northern long-eared bat are interesting if you are not a fan of spiders, because they both eat spiders actually. They're known to eat insects that are flying, and they're known to pick insects off the ground, and they particularly like spiders. So why are these bats endangered? What's threatening some of these species here in Canada? A big one is habitat loss. And habitat loss can mean either the roost in which they are using, so a tree might be cut down, but it could also mean the land in which they're foraging or which their insect prey is born and raised in. So things like wetlands or natural prairie land, when they are lost, can affect bats. We also see issues with things like climate change. Climate change might affect the insects that these bats eat, and when those native insects disappear, it can harm the bats. Another big one is roost disturbance itself. Lots of people tell us that they had no idea they had bats roosting on their property until they cut down an old tree, and the moment the tree hits the ground, it like explodes with bats. And frequently, people don't even know that leaving up a dead tree, if it's safe to do so, can be one of the best things because there's likely bats in it, rather than just cutting it down. Another big one is wind farms. Wind farms for our migratory species in particular, those three migratory species, over 200,000 bats are killed every year from wind farms. These bats are strangely attracted to the turbines, and then when they get hit by them, they die. But the big one that I want to focus on is white nose syndrome, and that's affecting our two hibernatory species, the little brown bat and the northern long-eared bat. And this is a wildlife disease. So white nose syndrome is a fungus that affects the bats. It's a fungus called by Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which you don't need to know. All you need to know is that it's a very destructive fungus. And how it works is that it infects the skin of our hibernating species, so it infects the wings and the noses of them. And the fungus itself doesn't kill them, but when they go into hibernation, it's really irritating. So it wakes them up over and over and over and over again. And when we talked about hibernation, I said that they can only wake up a certain number of times before they run out of those fat reserves. So that's what happens with these bats. They're woken up by this irritating and itchy fungus. They start burning through their fat reserves quicker than they can until they have no more fat left, and it's too early and there's no insects left. So they end up starving to death because of this fungus. And it's a really, really effective killer. When it enters a hibernaculum, which is the area bats hibernate in, it kills 95 to 100% of all the bats in that hibernaculum. And one of the big issues is that bats spread it amongst themselves so quickly. These bats are incredibly snuggly. They will come in contact with almost every other bat in their colony because they're like crawling up for a nice little snuggle, meanwhile passing this skin fungus from bat to bat. So it's a really deadly disease, and it's been spreading really, really quickly. So it was first discovered in New York State in 2006. This fungus originally came over from Europe, but the bats in Europe evolved with it. So they're not affected by it at all. But some poor splunker or cave person or whatever brought it over just on their shoe. It's a soil fungus, and accidentally spread it to North America. So since 2006, it's been moving outwards, and it's actually just hit Saskatchewan. We first found it in 2021, so this is fairly new for Saskatchewan to be dealing with this. Now, like I said, it's mostly spread by bats, bat to bat, as they swarm and go into hibernation, but it can also be spread by humans when they go into a cave and then they go into a different cave. So we saw that happen when it jumped all the way from eastern US all the way to western US when it jumped to Washington State a few years back. And that was because a human likely went from a cave over there to a cave over here, and it started spreading from there. Now, unfortunately, there is no cure and no vaccine for this disease. There's lots of people looking into it, but it's so relatively new, we still don't have any solution. So right now, it is just wiping out all of the bats in its path. There are more than 10 million bats so far that have been killed. And if you're more economic in mind, for every million bats that have been killed by this disease, it's predicted that up to 3 million pounds of insects exist now because of that. So when all of these bats are dying, all of these insects are no longer being eaten. So what can we do to help these bats? Unfortunately, because there's no cure, all we can do is try to make sure that the bats are as healthy as possible over the spring, summer, and fall to just give them the best chance of surviving on their own in the winter. So one of the things you can do is just become a bat advocate. There's so much misinformation about bats. There's so many people who want to get rid of them or kill them because they think they're diseased or they think they're going to drink their blood. So now that you've learned about bats, you can go ahead and address that misinformation when you hear it, which helps in the long term. But you can do other things like building a bat house on your property, like a farm, which can give the bats a nice place to stay. You can also leave their roosts alone. So if you have a dead tree or a snag on your property and it's safe to do so, leaving it up can actually help if bats are using it. You can also do things like avoiding caves and abandoned mines. Now, we don't really have caves and abandoned mines, but if you go elsewhere, don't go into them, especially in the winter time. If you go into a cave, you might wake the bats up, and they do not need another thing waking them up over hibernation and draining those fat reserves. You can also help bats by helping what they eat, and that's helping those native insects that they eat. You can do that by planting native gardens, like some of the wildflower seeds you get from here, by planting those sorts of plants to attract the native insects, and that supports those bat populations. You can also help insects by leaving the leaves that fall in the winter time. Lots of insects might overwinter in those leaf piles, which is really healthy for them. And also then just reducing the pesticides on your own property or around water bodies in which bats might be drinking from. And then another thing that we don't often think about as affecting bats, but you might think of as affecting birds, is if you have cats, keeping them indoors if possible. I know lots of farm cats are needed, but if you're in this town or city, taking your cats indoors is really helpful because they're actually responsible for a lot of bat deaths over the years and are very bad for birds as well. There's other ways too that you can help bats. You can actually become a citizen scientist and help us. So we as researchers are looking for roosting bats so that we might be able to study it and help the bats around Saskatchewan. So if you have roosting bats or know of where they are, please email us. We will take that information, and if it is useful and it's the species we're looking for, we might come out and study it. There's also, if you have a bat box, you can work with batwatch.ca, the neighborhood bat watch, to help them do counts on your bat box. That's a more national thing that you can, they track the populations with white nose syndrome. Now, you can also check out a bat detector kit. We don't have one here in Eastend, but there will be one available at the Maple Creek Public Library very shortly. I'm dropping it off tomorrow. And what's in these kits is a handheld bat detector that just plugs into your phone. So you're able to plug it into your phone, go outside at night. It tells you what species it's picking up. And then we have some more information about the bats and a data sheet that you can fill out with what species you hear. And then you'll be able to send that data sheet to us, and we can also use that data for you to tell us where bats are and what species you're hearing, which is useful because, you know, my lab is only so big, we can't be everywhere at once. But if you guys are going out and using the detectors to, one, learn about bats, but then also tell us where the bats are, it's great for us. So as you might remember, we can use these bat echolocator detectors because all the different species have different looking calls. So when you use this is what you would see. You would see bats flying overhead by looking at the echolocation as it goes through the app, basically. And luckily, the app is very smart that you use, so you don't need to memorize this and know which bat is which. The app will pop up and tell you what bat it is based on the echolocation it reads. And one of the reasons we're so interested, especially this fall, in people either telling us if they have roosting bats or using these bat detectors, is we are looking for bats in the fall. And that's because we don't really know where they're going. We know that the migrators are moving southward, and that's something that you might pick up is the 3 migratory species as they're passing overhead and making their journey south. But the hibernators, we have no idea where they're going because we expect them to hibernate in caves or deep rock crevices or abandoned mines, but we don't have those in Saskatchewan, or we don't have a lot of them. So we have no idea if the bats are going elsewhere, if they're going to Alberta, or if they're going to Manitoba, if they're going down to the States to hibernate, or if they're just finding different places that we don't expect. Some bats have been known to hibernate in like the root balls and trees and stuff. So if you do pick up the hibernating species in the next couple months, we're very curious to know what you pick up and where because we have no idea where they're going. And if you help our research, we might end up contacting you. If you do pick up a lot of activity, we might get more detail on where you were, and there's a chance that we might come out and we'll actually catch the bats and take samples of them. We want to know how healthy they are and where they're healthy. If we can find fatter bats that are more likely to survive the winter, survive white nose syndrome, we want to see if certain habitats make fatter bats, whether them being near forest or near wetland helps, whether it's something small like the temperature of their roost. If we can find what makes a healthier bat, we can hopefully increase that so that other bats can become healthier and survive white nose syndrome. So with that, I'd also like to thank Environment and Climate Change Canada as they have sponsored all of these lovely bat kits in my work and doing all of this outreach, as well as PCAT for having me. I'm so happy that you guys are here and that you've learned so much about bats, and thank you for being such great listeners. So if there's any questions, I am happy to take them.